Hey everyone, Dr. D here. I want to welcome you to a new series for biology. This is a biology for non-science majors course. We're using the textbook here. This is Biology, Concepts and Investigations by Hofnagels, by McGraw-Hill. So if you're using this textbook, this is going to cover all that material for you. I can't wait to get started with this new lecture series, so let's go ahead and get started.
Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Explain stuff.
All right, let's go ahead and delve right into Chapter 1. Chapter 1 covers the scientific study of life. So let's go ahead and get started. By the way, my cats will make appearances. I have two cats, Gizmo and Wicket. They are 4 years old and they are siblings. You could tell them apart. Gizmo does not have a spot on his nose, while Wicket does have a spot on his nose, and they'll probably make appearances here and there to say hi and to chime in, help me teach the course. So again, I am Dr. D. I'm going to be your instructor for this course, and let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 1, a scientific study of life. Now, biology is defined as the scientific study of life. And what you need to know in this chapter, I'm going to break down that term, scientific study of life. I want you to understand what scientific study means and what life means, because both of those are defined quite differently, and they can be quite difficult to wrap your brain around, believe it or not. Like the meaning of life, for instance, is quite difficult to define. So we're going to talk about what a scientific study is and what is life. Now, you might already know that life is comprised of all different forms, right? The life can range from bacteria, which are single-cell creatures, to fungi, to plants, to even you, right? We're all living organisms. So you would think it's really easy to define what life is, but it's actually quite difficult, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. One important thing to understand in biology is that living things are composed of cells. Living things are made up of at least one cell. That's called a unicellular organism. You ever heard of bacteria? Or you may have not heard of this one, but there's these creatures called Archaea. Have you ever heard of yeast, for instance, baker's yeast? Well, all of these are examples of unicellular creatures, a creature that's made up of one cell. But obviously, you and I are multicellular creatures. We are made up of many, many cells. But I want to tell you something. Life begins at the level of a cell. Typically, you cannot be simpler than a cell. You can't be like more rudimentary than a cell and be a living organism, right? Because organisms begin at the level of the cell. Now, you may have also heard of DNA, right? DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's what makes up our characteristics and our traits. You ever heard of genes? You inherited genes from your parents? Well, that's all contained in the DNA, and each organism has DNA in each of its cells. So a bacteria, even though a bacteria is a single cell organism, well, that cell contains DNA, and that DNA makes up genes, and those genes give that bacteria its characteristics. And if you're a multicellular organism like you and me, even though we're made up of billions upon billions upon billions of cells in our body, each one of those cells, for the most part, with some exceptions, has DNA inside, right? So each one of your cells contains your complete genome of DNA. Genome means all of the DNA inside of your cells. And we're going to learn later in this chapter, you're going to learn something really interesting. You're going to learn that your DNA codes for proteins, and those proteins are what give you your traits. We're going to learn all about how DNA results in traits, and the answer, it's through production of proteins. And do you remember earlier when I mentioned that life is actually not all that easy to define? Well, there's a reason, and that's because just when you think you've defined it with a simple sentence, there's an organism that appears that seems to defy that definition. So instead, you know what scientists do? Instead, scientists say that all life share 5 common characteristics, right? So if you possess most or all of these characteristics, then you are a living organism, right? So what are these 5 characteristics that give us our life, right? That give rise to life. Let's go through the 5 characteristics that give rise to life. The first characteristic of life is that it is organized. There is a clear organization inside of a living cell. And in multicellular creatures like you and me, we have all kinds of organization. Think of your respiratory system. Think of your nervous system. Think of all the different organs and tissues in your body. Are they not organized? Right? Otherwise, they wouldn't function. So living things are organized. Let's talk a little bit about how life is organized. Well, first of all, there are different levels of organization, all the way from the tiny, humble atom, which is the smallest chemical unit of a type of pure substance, so an atom of carbon, for instance. Then we have different levels. When atoms bond together, we have a whole nother level of organization called a molecule. A molecule is simply a group of joined atoms. For instance, DNA is a molecule, right? So that is a organized structure made up of different atoms. And then when molecules come together, they can give rise to a whole nother level of organization. In this case, an organelle. Do you know what an organelle is? An organelle is a functional part of a cell. So just like you and I have organs, right? Don't you and I have organs? We have a brain, we have lungs, we have a heart, we have kidneys and a liver, right? These are different organs in our body. Well, just like you and I have organs in our body, and those are functional parts of our body, well, the cell also has organelles. Organelles are functional parts of the cell. So for instance, this looks to be a chloroplast. This is an organelle. This is a structure that you would find inside of plant cells that allows plant cells to capture sunlight and, get that energy from sunlight, right, to make sugar. Isn't that interesting? So if you looked into a plant cell, this is a plant cell. Not only would you find DNA, because remember I said cells contain DNA, but you would also find other organelles, such as this chloroplast I just told you, and its job is to capture sunlight. Does that make sense? So have you ever seen a picture of a cell? Have you ever seen these structures inside of the cell, these things? If this whole thing is one plant cell, then all these, hi, Wicket, check it out, you guys. Wicket came to say hi. Wicket's here to say hi, everybody. He's scratching the monitor. So as I was saying, look inside of the cell. All of these different structures are organelles. They are functional parts of the cell. So I just told you about the plants that have chloroplasts. That's a functional part of the cell that captures sunlight. In fact, plants also have this structure. Hi, Wicket, look at him. He's come to cuddle. I told you he would make an appearance. And you could tell it's Wicket because he's got the spot on his nose. He loves to cuddle. Now, check this out. You see here, this is the nucleus. You guys have probably heard of the term nucleus before, right? Plant cells contain what's called a nucleus. That's where the DNA lives. And all these other structures, we're going to learn about all of them. All of these are different organelles inside of the cell. We're going to talk about all the different organelles. And did you know, if you are a multicellular creature, right, like you and me or plants or trees, We're not made up of one cell. So we're made up of many, 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 many billions of cells, if we're a human or a plant. Now take a look at this. Those cells can arrange themselves and give rise to a whole nother level of organization called a tissue. You see? So this would be plant tissue. And here you can see this is the epidermis of the leaf. The epidermis of the leaf is the coating. It's the upper layer of the cell, of the leaf, I should say. Now look, these tissues can give rise to organs. Organs. So for instance, these tissues come together to give rise to the organ, and in this case, the organ is the leaf. A leaf is an organ in a plant, which specializes in capturing sunlight. Now, these organs, don't they come together and form functional organ systems, right? The organ systems. Organ systems are organs connected physically or chemically that function together. So, for example, the above ground part of a plant, right? In your body, let me give you an example. In your body. You may have a stomach, right? That's an organ. But your stomach, along with your esophagus, along with your mouth, along with your pancreas, and along with, your small intestine and large intestine, well, don't those different organs give rise to the GI tract, right? The gastrointestinal tract, your digestive system, right? You see what I'm saying? And don't all these organ systems come together? Like you have different organ systems in your body, right? You have your digestive system, your cardiovascular system, your nervous system. Don't all of those come together to give rise to the multicellular organism? So take a look at this, right? The multicellular organism is the entire tree, which is made up of different organ systems, which is made up of different organs, which is made up of different tissues, which is definitely made up of billions upon billions of cells, which each contain different organelles, made up of molecules, made up of atoms, right? Do you see how this works? Isn't that interesting? So you see how life has organization to it? So take a look. Life is organized, right? And isn't that the first characteristic of life? Now, before we move on to the second characteristic of life, let's talk a little more about what is an organism. Because you've heard this term before, an organism, but what is it defined as? If you look down here, an organism is defined as a single living individual. For example, this acacia tree. This whole tree is one organism. Sure, it's made up of billions and billions of cells. However, it's a single organism, just like you are made up of billions of cells, but you are a single organism. So you and I and this plant are known as multicellular organisms. Okay, multicellular organisms are composed of many cells. Examples are sea sponges, moss, mushrooms, this tree, a fish, you and me. Now, here, that does not mean that all organisms are made up of numerous cells, right? Do you remember we talked about bacteria, and that was an example of a single cell organism? So single-celled organisms, they are an entire living creature that is made up of just one cell. For instance, bacteria and amoeba. You may have heard of amoeba. These are creatures made up of a single cell. By the way, this is some more important terminology for you. We're going to give you some terms to know. This will help you with your understanding of biology. Did you know that a population refers to members of the same species occupying the same place at the same time? So, for instance, you see all these acacia trees? These are a bunch of acacia trees all in the same location. that's a population. If there's a bunch of humans in a room, like a classroom, that's a population. So anytime you have numerous of the same species, numerous organisms in the same location, that's a population. Now, if you have different species taking up the same space, so for instance, here you have all these giraffe, and the giraffe are one species, and these acacia trees are a different species. When you have numerous different organisms, different species in the same space, this is known as a community. A community is defined as the populations of different species in a region. So on your college campus, a population might be all the squirrels on campus, right? All the squirrels running around on the trees, that's a population. However, when you're talking about the trees, the squirrels, the bees, the ants, the humans, and all the other bushes and trees, well, that is the community. I hope that makes sense. Now, if you take community and add the environment, that's an ecosystem. An ecosystem is defined as the living and non-living components of an area. So for instance, the savanna, right? In the savanna, don't we have let's break it down. In the savanna, we have the acacia trees. Okay, that's a population of acacia trees. We also have giraffe. Well, then that becomes a population. And then you have lions, right? So you have all the different you have a community, I should say. You have a community of trees, lions, giraffes, right? That's what a community is. Different species in the same area. However, if I count this rock, this boulder, and if I count the air and I count the soil and any streams that are nearby, that makes up the ecosystem. So think of ecosystem as community plus the physical environment, such as a stream, a river, the tundra, the desert, the savanna, right? All of these things. Does that make sense? And guess what all the different ecosystems on the planet make up? That's right, the entire biosphere. When you hear this term biosphere, you should think the entire Earth. This is our living planet, right? And all the ecosystems put together make up the Earth, the planet Earth, which supports life. Now, I explained to you how different levels of organization give rise to life, right? How atoms make up molecules, molecules make up organelles, organelles make up cells, cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up organ systems, and then organ systems make up the organism, a single living individual, right? But did you know that every time you go from one level, so for instance, from an atom to a molecule, or from a molecule to an organelle, or an organelle to a cell, every time you go from one level of organization to the next, okay, something special happens. And this is a concept known as emergent properties. Every time you go up one level, emergent properties arise. And what are emergent properties? Emergent properties have where different components interact and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So for instance, you have a brain cell, right? Think of your brain cell. All a brain cell does is it receives information and then it shoots information off, right? And those different cells interact with one another. This cell receives information and shoots a signal to the next cell, and then that cell receives that information and shoots information off to the next cell. So your brain is made up of the brain tissue, and so the brain cells make up this brain tissue, which then gives rise to thoughts, right? And imagination and creativity. Isn't that interesting? How the brain itself is greater than the sum of its parts. The brain cells, they just receive signals and send signals off. But somehow that together becomes an orchestra of thoughts and creativity and imagination. Isn't that neat? Another example of emergent properties is, let me show you something. Remember what I told you an organelle is? If you take a look here, an organelle is simply a functional part of a cell. So this is a chloroplast, right, which captures sunlight. And then you have, I don't know, a nucleus, which has DNA in it. And you have all these other organelles. Well, guess what? These organelles just have little jobs in the cell. But don't they all come together to give rise to life, right? A cell is the basic unit of life, right? A cell is a basic unit of life. And life is an emergent property. It's bigger than the sum of its parts. It's bigger than a chloroplast, right? Isn't that interesting? So that's a concept to understand from the book, Emergent Properties. And now we can finally head to the second characteristic of life. So let's head to the second characteristic of life. But before we do, let's take a look at this clicker question here. Which of the following statements is false? Can we answer this question? Let's see if Wicket can help us out. Wicket, let us know when we get to the false question. What do you think? Okay, Wicket. A, organs consist of tissues. Is that true? I think that's true. Yeah, Wicket says it's true. Awesome. Populations consist of organisms. That's true. Good job, Wicket. By the way, not just organisms, right? What type of organisms? That's right. There have to be the same species of organisms. That's right. Okay. Molecules consist of cells? No, Wicket got that right. He's always right, you guys. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. Molecules consist of cells? Come on. Remember, molecules make up organelles, then organelles make up cells, right? So it does not make any sense to think molecules consist of cells. So let's just look at the D and E answer choices real quick before we move on. D, organisms consist of atoms. That makes sense because all matter is made up of atoms. And E, organelles consists of molecules. That's exactly right. Molecules make up the organelles. Perfect. So the answer should be C. That's the false statement. Molecules definitely don't consist of cells. Next clicker question before we move on to the second property of life. Which is the best example of emergent properties? And remember, emergent properties are when you move up in complexity, and when you move up, the attribute of that level is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So let's look at what's greater than the sum of its parts. Let's go again. Wicket's going to help us out. What do you think of answer choice A, Wicket? Wearing glasses gives you better vision. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. How would that be greater than the sum of its parts, right? B, welding metal together makes an office building. Yeah, I agree, Wicket. Yeah, if you have a bunch of pieces of metal, those are just pieces of metal, but you put them together and you make an office building, the office building is greater than the sum of its parts. Does that make sense? So I think it's B. Let's look at C, wearing clothes to keep you warm. That doesn't make any sense. That's not greater than the sum of its parts. D, stacking cups on top of each other to make a plastic pyramid. You could argue that is greater than the sum of its parts, but that's not really it's not a new feature, right? It's not a new use. And then tying strings together to make a longer string. So let's see if we're right. Yes, welding metal together to make an actual different function, a building, something that's greater than the sum of its parts and has properties different than the sum of its parts, right? Isn't that interesting? So we can finally move on to the second characteristic of life, and that is that living things require energy, right? Every organism requires energy to live. You and I had breakfast this morning, hopefully, and we have lunch and dinner. We need to eat, right? And one of the big reasons we need to eat is we need energy. We need sugar. We need fat. We need energy in our diet so that we can run around and do all the stuff we do and study hard and get to class and run around and do all the things we want to do, right? Plants are no different. They need energy too, right? So look at this little depiction here. You've got the sun radiating light down on a plant, right? And the plant uses that energy in order to grow, right? And so all living things require energy. And if you take a look here, there's actually more organisms involved in this picture, isn't there? The sunlight comes down, striking a plant, and the plant captures the sunlight energy, and it uses that energy to grow and produce sugar. And by the way, did you know plants are called producers? Not only producers, primary producers, because they extract energy and nutrients from the non-living environment. They produce sugars. Think about it this way. When you think of producers, they can produce sugars and other important organic molecules like sugar. They can make organic sugars and other organic molecules without having to eat anything. They can extract nutrients from the soil, and they use energy from the sun. That's why they're called producers. They produce the energy that other organisms eat, right? So for instance, look at this little beetle. This little beetle is eating the leaf, and when it eats the leaf, it gets those organic molecules and that sugar out of the leaf, right? So would this beetle be a producer? That's right, Wicket. Wicket's always right. The beetle is not a producer because the beetle has to eat another organism to get its energy, right? It's not a producer. It's called a consumer. You and I are consumers, right? You and I are consumers. Can we make our own energy? Can we make our own organic molecules and sugars just by going out in the sunlight? No, we have to consume vegetables. We have to consume other organisms, right? Like meat and things like this, right? So we are consumers. And in the ecosystem, right? In the ecosystem, you have producers and you have consumers. But it doesn't matter if you're a producer or a consumer. Either way, you have to use energy, right? Does that make sense? The beetle gets its energy through consuming the leaf. And then when the leaf dies or when the beetle dies, what happens? Decomposers consume that the dead organisms. So for instance, if the beetle dies or if the leaf falls from the tree, then you have decomposers that feed off of the dead organic material, the dead cells. Does that make sense? But either way, it doesn't matter if you're a producer. It doesn't matter if you're a consumer. It doesn't matter if you're a decomposer. You are doing what? Right? You require energy and you recycle energy, right? And you transform and use energy, right? And we're going to learn all about energy. All right, are you ready for the third characteristic of life? And that is internal consistency. A fancy word for internal consistency is homeostasis. Homeostasis is your body's attempt to maintain internal conditions, ideal internal conditions. What do you do? Why am I wearing a sweater right now? Because it's right now upon filming, this is January right now, so it's quite cold. And, we try to keep our thermostat kind of low to save on heating costs, right? So, I'll put on a sweater because I'm cold. Why do I put on a sweater? It's because I'm trying to maintain my internal conditions. I'm trying to maintain my body's temperature, right? Conversely, when you put on a coat, it's because you're cold. However, when you're warm, because it's a sunny, hot day in the summer, your body will also try to maintain ideal conditions as well, won't it? You'll sweat, and sweating is your body's attempt to cool down. Does that make sense? You'll want to drink cold water to cool down. So that is a great example of what homeostasis refers to. Homeostasis is your body's attempt to maintain internal consistency, just like the thermostat in your house. If the thermostat in your house, if you set the temperature to 68 degrees, if it gets too warm, the thermostat will kick in and it will cool. It will cool the house. It will turn the heater off. If it gets too cold, it will turn the heater on. You see that? So you can think of homeostasis as the process by which a cell or organism maintains internal equilibrium. That's a fancy way of saying maintains the ideal internal conditions. Living things undergo homeostasis. Living things, organisms in general, try to maintain ideal internal conditions. And it's not just temperature, it could be ideal salt conditions, ideal moisture, ideal temperature, etc., etc. They're always trying to maintain the ideal internal conditions. Are you ready for the fourth characteristic of life? Living things reproduce, grow, and develop. And in fact, there are two forms of reproduction that you need to know about in biology. There is sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. What is the difference? In asexual reproduction, only one parent is involved and all offspring are virtually identical. So for instance, if a bacterial cell divides into two bacterial cells, those two cells are genetically identical. That's because that bacteria divided by asexual reproduction. They don't have a mom and a dad, right? So think about it this way. In asexual reproduction, an organism divides into another organism, right? There's no mom and dad. There's no sperm and egg involved. Does that make sense? And in fact, you could even see this phenomenon with strawberries. Strawberry plants sometimes reproduce asexually. Each of these new plants is identical to the parent plant. So you can see here's a parent plant. This is kind of neat. Here's a parent plant, and it kind of there was these offshoots of identical baby plants, but this is not the result of a sperm and an egg or pollen and egg. It's just the result of the parent plant dividing and producing offshoot plants. Does that make sense? Asexual reproduction results in no genetic differences in your offspring. You guys know how, when your parents had you have some genes from your mom and some genes from your dad, right? You are a kind of a mixture of genes, right? Well, that's the result of sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction results in offspring that are genetically different than their parents, right? There's some combination of the genes of their parents. Whereas in asexual reproduction, the offspring are genetically identical. It's like having twins, right? It's like your offspring being twins of you, right? They are not genetically different. So again, with sexual reproduction, two parents are involved and the offspring is genetically different from the parent. See here, you've got two different swan parents, a male and a female, and they had sexual reproduction to give rise to genetically different offspring. And did you know that sexual reproduction is preferable to asexual reproduction? Why? Because sexual reproduction is a successful strategy in changing environments because it increases the odds that some individuals will survive in a changing environment. Remember, when there's sexual reproduction, the offspring have new sets of genes. They have new combinations of genes. And that new combination might make them a little bit more resilient in a changing environment, right? Whereas if your offspring are just clones of you, and let's say the environment changes, well, then that offspring may struggle to survive. Does that make sense? So in nature, in biology, Swapping around genes and mixing genes, it leads to better survivability. It's called adaptation. And remember, in addition to reproduction, organisms also grow, right? In fact, the small strawberry plant and the baby swans, don't they need to grow into adult plants and adult swans? This is known as growth, where you start as a single cell organism and then you divide and grow and develop into a multicellular adult organism. So what do these terms mean? Growth refers to an increase in an organism's size, usually by cell division. You grew, you underwent growth from when you were conceived, right? The sperm fertilized the egg. You were a single zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg, by the way. That fertilized egg grew, right? It underwent growth. It divided into 2 cells, and then 4 cells, and then 8 cells, and then 16 cells, and so on, and so on, and so on. And that gave rise to you, right? The child, and then you grew. And during that time, you underwent development. What is development? How is development different than growth? Development refers to changes that occur as an organism matures, as an organism grows, right? Your cells specialize and other processes occur, right? Your body looks a lot different now than it did when you were born, right? You have specialized tissues that formed, you have specialized cells that formed, you grew a lot, right? That's your development. Does that make sense? Often growth and development occur hand in hand. Now let's finish up with some clicker questions here. Which of the following statements is true about reproduction? Let's get Wicket's help. Okay, now that we've learned a little bit about reproduction, let's get Wicket's help. A, sexual reproduction creates genetic variation among organisms. Yeah, exactly right. Remember, and that's what helps organisms to survive. Think about this real quick, Think about this with me real quick. Zoos and other institutions that try to care for animals, they get kind of nervous when there aren't many members of a population left, right? So think about a type of zebra or a type of lion. If there aren't many of this zebra on the planet, then this zebra, we start worrying about its ability to survive, right? We start worrying about what's called its fitness. Fitness meaning its ability to adapt, its ability to survive, right? And why is that? Well, because when you limit the gene pool by limiting the number of individuals in a population, well, you're not going to shuffle genes around as much, and that makes you more susceptible to dying off, right? Does that make sense? So yes, sexual reproduction is great because it increases genetic variation among organisms. B, because, so actually, which of the following statements is true? Okay, we're not looking for the false statement, are we? We're looking for the true statement. So yes, sexual reproduction creates genetic variation among organisms. There you go. So that is a true statement. Let's look at B just to be sure. B, sexual reproduction is most successful in unchanging environments. No, that's not true. Remember, by shuffling genes around, you are successful in changing environments. C, most plants reproduce only asexually. No, that's not true. I showed you the strawberry plant with its little offshoots, but plants can also reproduce sexually. That's where, you've heard of pollen? Pollen is actually the plant's sperm inside of the pollen. So plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually, believe it or not, most of them. D, asexual organisms do not actually reproduce. Well, they do reproduce, it's just not shuffling genes around, right? So I would say A. What do you think, Wicket? Yeah, Wicket agrees. It's A. And it's A. Yes, the true statement is sexual reproduction creates genetic variation among organisms. Perfect, perfect. Now, let's go on to the final characteristic of life, the fifth characteristic of life. Now, the final characteristic of life is that life evolves. Evolution is the final and fifth characteristic of life. Evolution simply refers to changes in genes over time. They call them gene frequencies also. The frequency of different genes changing over time, the genes themselves changing over time. Have you ever heard of a mutation? A mutation simply refers to a change in a gene. And if you remember, genes give you your traits. So if you change a gene or mutate a gene or change the frequency of a gene, well, then you're going to have different traits. Take a look at this seahorse here. You see how the seahorse blends perfectly with the red coral among which it lives? How is it that so many organisms like this seahorse seem to perfectly suit their environment? This pygmy seahorse blends into the coral habitat where it lives because of its genes. Those genes changed over time through, remember, sexual reproduction, as well as mutations. And this has led to adaptation. That means that this particular set of genes helps to camouflage this particular seahorse in its habitat. Other seahorses with different genes would not blend in as well. Now, just imagine what would happen if this coral reef died away. If this coral reef died away, this seahorse would have to change its genes. It would have to adapt and evolve to its new environment to blend in there. And by blending in and adapting to its environment, the seahorse is well hidden from predators. It's not likely to be spotted. It's not likely to be eaten. It has better fitness. It has a better chance to survive. And when it does survive, it reproduces and it passes along those genes. So its offspring will have those traits as well, and those offspring will have a good chance of surviving as well. All right, moving on to the next section of this chapter. Now we're talking about how organisms are classified and categorized and organized. This is the study of taxonomy. You may have heard of taxonomy. Scientists use taxonomy to name and classify organisms. So have you ever heard of domains or kingdom? Have you ever heard phylum or family? Have you ever heard of a species or a genus? Have you ever heard of these terms? I know you've heard of species before. What do all these terms mean? Well, this is the realm of the taxonomist. Taxonomists look at different creatures on the planet and they try to group them based on their relatedness. It's like, well, if you stand upright, well, you're a hominid and you belong with the other hominids, like the great apes and the chimpanzees and the monkeys and the humans, right? You group them together because you have similar features. For instance, you're all animals, you're mammals, you have a backbone, you stand up straight, you stand on two legs. Well, then you're going to be in the same group, right? Does that make sense? Whereas leopards and panthers and jaguars and lions and cheetahs, they're going to be in a similar group as well, you see? So that's what a taxonomist does, groups organisms based on their relatedness. Now, all living organisms belong to one of three major domains of life, according to taxonomy. The domain is the most broad category of life. If you are a living thing on the planet Earth, you belong to one of the three domains of life. What are the three domains of life? Here we go. There is the domain bacteria, For instance, you've heard of E. coli or Salmonella, right? Those belong to the domain Bacteria. The domain Archaea, which you've probably never heard of because they tend to live in extreme environments, and the domain Eukarya, which you and I belong to. Spoiler alert, you and I are animals, and animals fall under the domain Eukarya. That's it. Those are the 3 domains of life. If you are a living creature on the planet Earth, you belong to one of those 3 domains. Isn't that interesting? So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the 3 domains of life. First of all 3 domains include one or more kingdoms or lineages representing thousands to millions of different species. Take a look at this. This is interesting. 2 of the domains, the domain Bacteria and the domain Archaea, these are made up of small, what are called prokaryotic, unicellular organisms. Do you know what a unicellular organism is? We already talked about that. It's an organism made up of a single cell. They're small. In fact, these cells are smaller than our cells. Our cells are called eukaryotic cells. However, the domain Bacteria and Archaea consist of prokaryotic cells. And so prokaryotic cells are cells that are actually about 1/10 the size of a eukaryotic cell. I wonder why. We're going to talk about why. Why are these bacteria and archaea, why are those prokaryotic cells so much smaller than our eukaryotic cells? And what's the difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell? We'll take a look here. The prokaryotes are creatures that are made up of prokaryotic cells. And remember, what 2 domains consist of prokaryotic cells? Can you beat Wicket? That's right, Wicket. The bacteria and the archaea, those 2 domains of life are made up of a single prokaryotic cell. And I'm going to tell you exactly what that means to be a prokaryotic cell. And you and I, our cells are what type of cells? That's right, Wicket. Eukaryotic cells. That's why we belong to the domain eukarya. In fact, if you are a creature that has cells that are eukaryotic cells, you belong to the domain eukarya. So as long as your cells are eukaryotic, you belong to the domain eukarya. Now, I want you to look at these images at the bottom right here. Look at this. Here is a representative from the domain Bacteria on the left and a representative of the domain Archaea on the right. Again, these are single cell organisms and they are very small, but I want you to see what it says here. These cells lack nuclei. Do you guys remember I told you about the nucleus? The nucleus is this structure that has the DNA inside, right? Well, that's a nucleus. Bacteria and archaea, they're prokaryotes because they lack a nucleus. In fact, that's the defining feature of a prokaryotic cell. A prokaryotic cell lacks a nucleus. This means that there is the DNA, instead of being inside of this membrane structure called the nucleus, these cells still have DNA, okay? This bacterial cell still has DNA. This archaeal cells has DNA because all cells have DNA. However, this DNA is just floating around inside of the cell. The DNA is not inside of a membrane. Does that make sense? So what makes you so special? What makes you a eukaryote? Well, that's because you have a nucleus, right? So organisms where the DNA is inside of a membrane, that's called a nucleus. Okay, they're eukaryotes. Organisms where the DNA is just floating around inside of the cell, prokaryotes. And that's the gist of it. Of course, it gets more complicated than that, but we're trying to keep it pretty straightforward. For instance, take a look at this organism. Believe it or not, this giant blob here, this blob-looking thing is a single-cell organism. It's made up of one cell. And inside that cell, we have a nucleus, right? So even though this creature is a single-cell creature, it has a proper nucleus. That means its DNA is inside of that membrane, right? So what would you say? Can you beat Wicket? Is this single-cell creature, this blob right here, is it a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell that belongs to the domain eukarya? That's right, Wicket. This guy must belong to the domain eukarya because it has a nucleus. Does that make sense? In fact, this is an image of amoeba. I told you about amoeba a little earlier. An amoeba, because it's a creature with a nucleus, it belongs to the domain eukarya. So that should tell you something important, right? If you belong to the domain eukarya, you could be a single-cell creature like this amoeba, or you could be a multi-cell creature like you and me, right? In fact, did you know these single-cell creatures have a name? They're called the protists. Protists are the most diverse group of eukaryotes. They belong to the domain eukarya with multiple lineages, including amoeba, slime molds, algae, other species, and many of these protists are single-cell eukaryotes. Single cell, but they don't have to be. Some of them are multicellular, but they are single-cell eukaryotes. And have you ever heard of animals or fungi or plants? Well, these are kingdoms within the domain eukarya. So if domain is the most broad category of taxonomy, well, then domain breaks down into different kingdoms. Does that make sense? So if you are in the domain eukarya, you could belong to the kingdom Animalia because you're an animal, or you could belong to the domain Plantae because you are a plant, right? So that should tell you something about the hierarchy of organization with taxonomy. The most broad are 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And from there, you have kingdoms. Kingdoms are more specialized and specific, right? Specific than domains, right? It's more heading towards more specificity, they call it. Again, remember under eukarya, we have animals. Animals are a familiar group of eukaryotes, including vertebrates. Vertebrates are organisms that have a backbone like you and me, right? Fish, frogs, and mammals are vertebrates. But there are also invertebrates, organisms without a real backbone, such as this bee, right? This bee is a animal, but it is an invertebrate. It is an animal without a backbone. So do you see what a taxonomist would do? A taxonomist would group all the animals with a backbone together. And those are known as the chordata, right? And it would group all the animals like a bee without a backbone together in a different group as well. Does that make sense? Again, another kingdom besides animals, another kingdom are the fungi. Fungi are nature's decomposers. These are the cells that break down dead organic material. These fungi make up, organisms such as mushrooms or yeast, things like this. What about the kingdom Plantae? These are the plants. Plants typically are the producers. Remember the primary producers in an ecosystem. They capture sunlight and they use that to make sugars, and they either directly or indirectly nourish the entire ecosystem. So let's go to our clicker question number 4. And we're going to get Wicket's help, of course, as always. How are eukaryotes different from prokaryotes? Let's figure it out. Okay. Eukaryotes are always multicellular. Is that true or false? That's right, Wicket. False, right? I just showed you eukaryotes have a nucleus. Just because you're a fancy eukaryotic cell doesn't mean you have to be multicellular like you and me. Remember, amoeba are single cell eukaryotes, for instance. In fact, many of the protists are single cell eukaryotes, right? Have you ever heard of paramecium or amoeba? Have you heard of giardia? Have you heard of plasmodium or trypanosoma? If you haven't, no worries, but all of these are examples of single cell eukaryotes. Next, prokaryotic cells never have nuclei. This is true. Prokaryotic cells never have nuclei. That means they don't have a membrane surrounding their DNA. Their DNA is just floating around in the cell. I would say the answer is B. All right, let's look at C. Only prokaryotes are autotrophs. I don't know if this chapter even defined autotrophs, but autotrophs are self-feeders. They're basically producers, right? Do you guys remember producers? They capture sunlight or they use their environment to get their energy. Well, photosynthetic organisms are autotrophs. So that C is not true because prokaryotes can be autotrophs, eukaryotes can be autotrophs. D, only eukaryotes are living organisms. That doesn't make sense. All living organisms belong to one of the three domains of life, and all of those are living organisms. So again, what is the correct answer? B. And that's correct. Now for this final section of the chapter, section 1.3, we need to understand how science works. But let me take you back. Do you remember at the very beginning of this chapter, I told you something about biology? Let's go back. Take a look here at the top left. Remember when I told you biology is the scientific study of life? It's not just the study of life, it's the scientific study of life. So now we know what life is, right? Remember, life defied a single definition, like an easy peasy definition. Instead, do you remember what life is? Life includes organisms that portray, that have these different characteristics. You remember the 5 characteristics of life we talked about. Now, we know what life is, but what is a scientific study? What is a scientific study and how is it just different than a regular study? That's what we're going to break down in section 1.3. That's what we're breaking down now. What in the world is science and what does it mean to have a scientific study? That's what we're focusing on now. Well, have you ever heard of the scientific method? Well, in short, scientific studies follow the scientific method. The scientific method is a series of steps that lead you towards conclusions. Science begins with what's known as an observation. A person makes an observation about the universe. The next step, remember I said it's a series of steps, right? The scientific method is a series of steps. The first step is to make an observation about the universe. The next step is to formulate a question. Ask a question. What is this thing I just discovered? What is this phenomena I'm looking at? Next, consult prior knowledge. What does that mean? Go online and look at papers and look at what's already known about what you're looking at. Has that already been described? Is this new thing you're looking at published? Next, formulate a hypothesis. What is a hypothesis? I'm going to get into that in a second. Next, the hypothesis allows you to make predictions. It allows you to design an experiment. Did you guys know that the purpose of an experiment is to test your hypothesis? And then following the experiment, you can collect and interpret your data. You can consult prior knowledge to draw conclusions and publish your findings in a peer-reviewed journal. These are the steps that make up the scientific method. And I'm going to go into these steps in a little bit more detail with you. But in general, all scientific inquiry follows a standard process. Each step in the process is interrelated, and these steps make up what is known as the scientific method, the way scientists conduct science, right? So when they say biology is the scientific study of life, that means biologists study living organisms using these particular steps. So I want you to make a note, and that is that the scientific method begins with this step right here, making an observation. All science begins with an observation. You should make a note of that. Now, you might be asking, what is an observation? It's something we can see, hear, smell, read, detect, and so on. So we can see something interesting. That is our observation. Now let me ask you this. What's the next step to the scientific method? First you make an observation. Can you beat Wicket? What's the next step? That's right, Wicket, as always. Formulating a question. So the question is, what is this thing I'm looking at? So imagine if I see something glowing in the sky. That's my observation. I noticed a small glowing dot in the sky. Well, my question could be, what is that glowing dot in the sky? Is that, for instance, is that a planet I'm looking at? Is that a star I'm looking at? What is that glowing dot in the sky, right? I formulate a question based on my observation. Does that make sense? So again, scientific method always begins with an observation followed by a question. And just keep in mind that at this point you'd want to consult prior knowledge. I might want to look in and see if anyone's described that particular spot in the sky. Has anyone else detected it, and has anyone else studied it and said it's a star, for instance? I want to know, because I don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? If someone's already discovered what that spot in the sky is, I don't need to be putting in a bunch of time and effort and money to research that again, right? So I need to consult prior knowledge and see if anyone else has described that spot in the sky. Next, what's the next step? That's right, formulate a hypothesis. So I'm going to explain what a hypothesis is next. Let's do that next. All right. A hypothesis is a tentative explanation for observations. It is a testable idea of how to answer a question. So that sounds pretty complicated, but what does that mean? A hypothesis essentially is an answer to your question. Remember, what was my question? Can you beat Wicket? What was my question? That's right, Wicket. My question was, what is that spot in the sky? I consulted prior knowledge. I found nothing. So what can I do when I formulate my hypothesis? Do you guys remember a hypothesis is a possible explanation? A possible explanation that needs to be what? Testable. Testable. So let's do this. What if I come up with the hypothesis, it's a planet? It's a planet. Is that a good hypothesis? Sure, because it's a possible explanation. And can I test for it? I could test for it. I could use telescopes. I could use other types of instruments and determine if it's a planet. Maybe it's Mars I'm looking at. I'm not sure. But if it was Mars, then I would have picked it up in my consulting prior knowledge step, right? So it's probably not a planet, but it's still a good hypothesis because it's a possible explanation and I could test for it. Does that make sense? So as long as but does that mean it's the real answer? Does that mean just because it's a good hypothesis, does that mean it's the real answer? No, not necessarily, right? It's a possible answer, but it might not be the real answer. Does that make sense? So just because something's a good hypothesis doesn't mean it is the answer, right? Does that make sense? So in fact, you could come up with 1,000 hypotheses. Did you know that? So for instance, I could say that spot is a planet. That's a great hypothesis because it's an explanation that I could test for. I could say that spot is a star. That's another great hypothesis because it's an explanation I could test for. I could say that spot is a satellite, like one of these satellites that people put up in space, right? That's another great hypothesis because I could test for that too. But you see, only one of those might be the right answer. Does that make sense? So just because something is a good hypothesis doesn't mean it's necessarily the right answer. So what do you do to test the hypothesis? Don't you have to test to see which one is the correct hypothesis, right? They can't all be correct. It can't be a satellite and a star and a planet, right? So I need to test my hypothesis, right? And so when I do, I can make predictions. I could say, well, if it's a planet, it should do this with the telescope. I should be able to see X, Y, and Z. If it's a star, I should be able to see these other features. If it's a satellite, well, then it should twinkle. It should do this other thing. So does that make sense? I can make predictions and design an experiment. So let me ask you this, and let me ask Wicket this. What was the point of an experiment? That's right, Wicket. The whole point of an experiment is to test to see if your hypothesis is correct, to see which one of your 100 hypotheses is correct, or 10 hypotheses, or 2 hypotheses. What is the correct hypothesis? The experiment could be using a powerful telescope to look at that spot. It could be using other instruments that measure light from that spot. The experiment is designed to test the hypothesis. And through the experimentation, you're going to figure out which one is the correct hypothesis and which ones are the incorrect hypotheses. Did you know the incorrect hypotheses are called falsified hypotheses? You falsified, that shows you showed those hypotheses to be false, right? So for instance, if that spot I'm looking at is a star, well then that's great. Congratulations to me. I discovered a new star. That means the star hypothesis was correct, but the planet hypothesis and the satellite hypothesis were falsified. They were not correct. And how did I know? I did it through an experiment. From that experiment, I collect data. I interpret the data from the experiment. I then consult more knowledge. I draw conclusions based on my data, and then I send that manuscript. You know what a manuscript is? It's just a write-up. It's like a lab report. It's a write-up of all my conclusions. I send that manuscript for peer review where other scientists look at my research, other scientists look at my methodology, and they look and see if it passes muster. And if so, if everything checks out and I did strong science, it gets to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it gets to contribute one more star to our knowledge of the universe. Isn't that interesting? So that's essentially how science works. Isn't that neat? So again, let me ask you this. This is an important question. Maybe you can beat Wicket. Let me ask you this. Do you think a hypothesis has a question mark at the end of it? When you state a hypothesis, does it have a question mark? That's right, Wicket. No question mark at the end of a hypothesis is stated as an answer. A hypothesis is a possible answer. Like for instance, what I'm looking at is a star, right? That speck is a star. You see how there's no question mark at the end? I'm stating it as if it's the truth, right? That is a star. That is a planet. That is a satellite. That it's stated like a fact, right? Your question has a question mark at the end, but a hypothesis is stated as an answer. It might not be the right answer, but it's an answer. And what else? So what else does a good hypothesis have? Not only is it a possible answer, but it needs to be what? Can you beat Wicket? That's right, Wicket. It needs to be testable. What does that mean, to be testable? It means I need to be able to test it by doing an experiment, right? What if, for instance, I said, oh, that speck up there, that speck is just me hallucinating? I can't test for that. Does that make sense? Or what if I say that speck up there is, I don't know, it's like some kind of Greek god, or something like that. I don't know. There's no way to test for those types of things, right? Does that make sense? There's no detectors for that kind of thing. So the hypothesis needs to be testable, right? Does that make sense? It needs to be something you can actually see, measure, test with an experiment, right? That's what testable means. All right, great. So let's move on and learn a little bit more about what science is, and then we can wrap up this chapter. Now, going into a little bit more detail about experiments and what makes for a good experiment, remember the whole point of an experiment is to test the hypothesis, right? To show if the hypothesis is true or falsified. Scientists design experiments to test hypotheses under controlled conditions. Now, what we're going to talk about next is variables. So what are variables and what are controls? Because good experiments have variables as well as controls. Experiments are designed with variables and controls. Well-designed experiments include independent, dependent, and standardized variables. First of all, what is a variable? A variable is defined as any factor, trait, or condition that can exist in differing amounts or types. And like I said, you have independent, dependent, and standardized variables in experiments. So what is an independent variable? The independent variable is the variable that is being manipulated. So if I do an experiment, and let's say I'm doing an experiment about types of coffee, okay, then the types of coffee I choose, the different bean types I choose to experiment on, that's the independent variable. It's what I, as the experimenter, have control over. Think about that. When you think independent variable, think of what does the scientist have control over. Then the dependent variable is simply what is being measured. So for instance, if I want to know how much caffeine is in each of the different types of beans, I'm going to measure the caffeine, but that's not what I'm controlling, right? That's what I'm trying to figure out, right? In science, we call the independent variable the cause and the dependent variable the effect, right? The independent variable is what you control. The dependent variable is what you're trying to figure out, right? And then the standardized variable is held constant for all subjects. So for instance, how many beans are you measuring? Like, what's the weight of the beans? Like, are you looking at 1 pound of this type of bean versus 1 pound of that type of bean? You see, you want to keep all that standardized. You don't want to measure 2 kilos of this bean and 1 pound of that bean. That setup wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. Additionally, a well-designed experiment also includes control and test groups. The control group is simply the group that serves as a baseline used for comparison. So for instance, coffee beans from plants that have been treated with only water. The experimental group, this is the group that may or may not show different results from the control group. This could be coffee beans that, from plants that have been treated with extra fertilizers. Perhaps we're studying how these fertilizers affect the caffeine amounts in the beans. Does that make sense? So the control group is there to serve as a baseline. The experimental group has the addition of that experimental variable so that you can see the difference. Now, one more important fact that I want you to know about science is I want you to know about the definition of a scientific theory. This is so important, and I can almost guarantee it's going to be on an exam. The scientific theory, I want you to be able to define a scientific theory. Did you know a scientific theory is an explanation for a natural phenomenon? It may be based on years of data collected in hundreds of different experiments. So when a scientist declares that there's a concept is now a theory, that means that there's years of data backing it up and hundreds of experiments backing up this theory. Does that make sense? So let me ask you this. What is the difference between a hypothesis and a scientific theory and a fact? Remember, a hypothesis is a possible explanation. We could either do an experiment to show the hypothesis is correct, or a hypothesis could be falsified. It could be wrong, right? We don't know. We just have to do an experiment. A hypothesis could be totally wrong. Compare that to a theory. Could a theory just be completely wrong? It is highly, highly, highly unlikely, because a scientific theory is based on usually years of research, countless publications, all supporting that theory. Does that make sense? So for instance, there is a theory called cell theory, and that is the theory that living organisms are made up of at least one cell. Well, that makes sense. From the dawn of biology, scientists have noticed that a living organism is at least one cell big, and all living cells come from pre-existing cells. So a cell divides to give rise to more cells, and cells are the basic unit of life, right? So scientists have studied for years that the basic unit of life is a cell. So there's this cell theory that states that living organisms are made up of cells. Now, how likely do you think that that theory is wrong, right? That tomorrow they're going to figure out, no, we were totally wrong and life does not begin at the level of a cell. Does that make sense? So a scientific theory is as close as you will get a scientist to saying something is, proven. Does that make sense? Scientists usually do not use the word proven because that's such a strong word. A scientist will not use that word. Scientists instead will say something is a theory. So the closest a scientist will ever get to saying the term proven is calling it a theory. That's how strong this term is. It's basically an actual, it's an actually true phenomenon in the universe, right? Is a theory. Okay, and how is that different from a fact? A fact is a truth. Okay, and how might this confuse non-scientists? Most of you are non-science majors, right? In biology 1408 usually, non-science majors. What do you think? When someone says something's a theory, what do you think? Well, in general vernacular, a theory is a hunch, right? So to the guy on the street, if I tell the guy on the street, hey, I have a theory, the guy on the street might say, oh, so you have a hunch, like someone stole my slippers. I have a theory, the dog did it, right? You see, in general vernacular, that makes sense, because in general vernacular, theory means a guess. Does that make sense? But in science, a theory means anything but a guess. It's basically the closest a scientist will become to saying proved, because it has so much data backing it up. All right, and with that, let's end this chapter 1. Thank you so much for joining me. It's going to be a fun series. More videos to come as we continue exploring this biology series by Hofnagels.
Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. A Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D. Dr. D, Dr. D, Dr. D.